how much of what is in the Tanakh can you be 100% sure was there from the beginning? Also, could it be something that has been changed or lost in translation? And have you found any contradictions within the Old Testament that could point to that this is not 100% God's word? Or even, do you think that it is God's word directly, or has it been passed on from person to person and then written down?
So when we take into account all the different manuscript traditions of the Torah, you find that there is absolutely no indication of extreme corruption or unfaithfulness of the biblical text as we have it today, because there is no adding to or taking away from entire chapters of the Torah, and the only major changes you find are an addition or a lacking of a particular word. And again, as I said, these are literally just a handful. In the manuscript tradition of the Jews themselves, you only have roughly 12 or 14 letter differences, not word differences. Again, essentially just variant spellings of the same word. Now, that means that for the thousands of years that the Jews have been in exile from the land of Israel, the only divergence from the text that they had at that time that they were not in exile is a difference of 12 or 14 letters. Now that is quite unbelievable, and to me indicates trustworthiness not just of the text but also of those who are preserving it. For this reason, Jews, as I think pretty much any people or nation, don't really give consideration to those few textual variants that exist among the biblical text as preserved among non-Israelites, just for the same reason that if other countries were to present the United States with a copy of the original Constitution of the United States, the United States would trust their own copies of the Constitution despite the ancient origin of the copies found among other countries. Now, I know the American Constitution still exists, so this is just theoretical, but apply this reasoning to any other text or collective memory of a person's nation's history, and it's the same idea. It's totally reasonable to trust your own history as you have recorded it than to trust other people's accounts of it. So your other questions are, could there be something changed or lost in translation? That is absolutely the case, and this is just another reason why it is more logical to rely upon the text of the Bible as preserved in the original language of the Bible rather than give such weight to other translations in totally even non-Semitic languages such as Latin or Greek. And so anyone who has a level of fluency in more than one language should know that translation can always be a problem. Things can always be lost or misinterpreted in translation. I know that several of the differences in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, in contrast to the Jewish version, are differences that can easily be explained by translation difficulties. Not that the translators of the Greek Bible intended to change what it says in Hebrew, nor that the Hebrew is different from what the Greek translators had, but rather that they were looking at a particular Hebrew word that could be understood in more than one way, and they chose a particular way to translate it that is perhaps more exacting than the word that appears in the original Hebrew. Likewise, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are several commentaries to the Bible that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them are some texts of the Bible that are more or less just the biblical text, but that have commentaries inserted into them. So I find it not unreasonable to think that this could likewise explain some of the variants in words that occur also in the Torah as preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's interesting to note that some of the variants where the Dead Sea Scrolls differ from the biblical Hebrew text among the Jews are the same as the way that the Jewish tradition of the Aramaic paraphrase of the Bible chooses to paraphrase the biblical text. What I mean by this is that Jews have both the biblical Hebrew text, then we have a traditional Aramaic commentary to the biblical text, which is more or less word for word a translation of the Hebrew to Aramaic, but it very often will choose a translation to Aramaic that is more specific, whereas the Hebrew could refer to a few different things. And sometimes it also inserts several words, a phrase, or even a whole sentence that is not in the biblical Hebrew to give further clarification to the context or the intention of the biblical text. So this Aramaic translation is not a word-for-word translation. It is sort of a interpretive paraphrase slash commentary that goes verse by verse. And the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes parallel this, as well as the Greek Septuagint. So all this taken together leads me to conclude that the biblical Hebrew text, as we have it preserved among the Jews, is most reliable. And even with all the variants in the text is extremely reliable given the ancient origin of the Bible. And also those variants that do exist are minute and certainly not substantial, as some would like to simplify the matter and have people think, so as to cause them to not trust the Hebrew Bible based on lack of knowledge. You ask, are there internal contradictions indicative of non-divine origin? So there are some places in the Tanakh that, to someone unfamiliar with biblical law, with Jewish law, would appear to be contradictions, such as the times or lengths of different kings ruling on their thrones. So the time from which a king begins to rule on his throne and the amount of years that it is said that he ruled can actually be different within the context of Jewish law. There are many things like this that the general population of the world has no knowledge of because they're unfamiliar with ancient Israelite tradition and practice. Also, some of these contradictions are certainly just a result of translation problems. You also ask, is it possible that the Hebrew Old Testament was divinely given by God, but that it was only recorded generations later? So here we need to make a distinction between the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. The Jewish understanding is that God divinely dictated to Moses the words of the Torah and he wrote them down. And his recording of his death is no different than his recording of things that occurred before his life. That shouldn't be a stretch of the imagination for someone who believes that God could reveal the past to a prophet, so he could also reveal the future. The Torah also records that God commanded Moses to write the words down. The Torah records that Moses has written these words down. It could very well be, and I think it's reasonable to assume, that the Torah was written at different stages, even if you want to think that Moses wrote it all down in his lifetime. It appears that Moses wrote them down at stages. That's just common sense. I do not believe that the Torah was written generations upon generations afterwards. I see no indication of that other than if one just wants to presume on the outset that it had to be that case. The rest of the Hebrew Bible is different because it's composed of several different books from several different time periods, and these books don't necessarily even claim to have all been written at one time, and Jewish tradition doesn't demand that they were all written at one time. In fact, sometimes the Jewish tradition, mainly as preserved in the Talmudic texts, actually teaches that some of these books of the Old Testament were written well after the occurrences happened, when certain sages of Israel collected other books and selected from them what were most important to them, or they, which is actually the whole Hebrew Bible itself. There were many books and writings of the prophets that were not preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Jews don't believe that only those books in the Hebrew Bible were the only books ever written under divine inspiration. Rather, they are the only books that the ancient sages of Israel regarded as greatly beneficial to the Jewish people for many generations to come, whereas several other writings may have been divinely inspired, but they regarded as being less necessary for future generations. Perhaps they were prophecies touching upon things that had already taken place. It is not that they prohibited learning those other books altogether, but simply that they did not apply to those other books, that they didn't choose to be included in the Hebrew Bible. They didn't apply to those books certain laws which would assure their preservation. So this is the main thing that sets apart the books of the Hebrew Bible from other ancient prophetic books that perhaps existed but we no longer have. Those books of the Hebrew Bible were given a special status, such as ways in which a Jew is obligated to treat those books that would assure their preservation for generations to come. Also, as I said, while we understand the Torah to be dictated to Moses by God word for word, this is not necessarily the case with regard to the other books of the Old Testament. In fact, even what we consider dictated word for word in the other books of the Old Testament, it is believed to be dictated by means of an angel and not directly by God. Whereas Moses, according to the Torah, received direct revelation from God without the mediation of an angel, something which distinguished him from all other prophets to come. So I hope this did justice to your question. Yes, I do believe that Tanakh is well preserved and totally reliable, and any question of its trustworthiness is a matter of self-choice if one simply wants to absolve himself of all responsibility to the creator of the universe. For I don't know any other options or possibilities that there could be that would claim to be the revealed will of the God of creation, the God of history.